Hi, my name is Tanisha Parham Kelly. My research project is titled Surviving the Beautiful 2021. The reason why I chose this title is because my research paper is discussing how the African American community has been treated in America unfairly. And at the end of my paper, my objective is to explain ways to survive here. So, thus, we have Surviving the Beautiful. In this slide, what we have is my actual thesis statement that is in my paper. The reason why I chose to include this thesis statement in the presentation is because in our instructions from Dr. Huckins, she clearly says that we need to provide or acknowledge what our thesis is, and then from there move on to explain a few of the main ideas, which is what I've done. Here I decided to give a description or a definition for white supremacists or white supremacy. A lot of times when I speak to people that are not liberal arts or humanities or sociology majors, they think that they understand the terminology and what's being discussed, and a lot of times they really don't. So here I've included the actual definition of what a white supremacist is. The reason why this was important is because I don't like to stereotype, and I don't like to box one type of person or thing. And so it's very important for me to get across to the audience exactly what a white supremacist is, so that the people, the audience that I'm targeting doesn't assume that all people of the white race are white supremacists, because that is completely false. So I decided to include this definition for clarity. My paper begins with me giving the foundation of the United States of America and how African Americans came to be here in the first place and actually be in the position that they are in here. And that would not be able to be true if it weren't for the founding fathers or for the first few presidents that we had that basically created the laws and rules and regulations that were in place back then. And actually some are still in place now, and those are discussed further in my paper. But this is an example of three presidents that were able to place rules and laws and regulations in the early years of slavery and even post slavery. Their ideals were those that supported slavery and racial inequality and discrimination. So here we have President Thomas Jefferson, the fifth president James Monroe, and the seventh president Andrew Jackson. However, in my paper I do list about 10 of the early presidents that were more explicit with their thoughts of race and racial inequality. Here we have Stephen Miller and the 45th president, Donald Trump. It has been said that Trump is racist, and there isn't many people that disagree with that I found during my research. It's actually a lot of people that agree with that. But there are a few that don't feel that way. However, it's known that his advisor, Stephen Miller, is a known supporter of white supremacy and the concepts. And so in my paper, it was very important for me, especially at the time when this research, when I first started doing this research, because the 45th president, Donald Trump, was the actual president at the time. It was really important for me to include information about Trump and his advisor, and how their thoughts and ideologies were congruent to those of the presidents of the past, because it shows that the government hasn't really changed much at the foundation level. And so not much has changed in the Black community. So a lot has changed, but there's still more room for improvement. The reason why is the reason why I included this graph here. The reason why is because of the lack of minority representation in politics. Now, as I said previously, there has been growth and there has been change, but there is a lot of room for a lot more growth and a lot more change. And so this graph showing the ethnic diversity in Congress, yes, it's growing, but the numbers are still very low as far as minority representation goes. And so this would explain why African Americans have always felt that the government doesn't support them, nor are they concerned with their issues, because the people that are in office don't face the issues that they face. So they lack empathy and sympathy, and even awareness at times. So in my paper, it was very important for me to discuss the lack of minority representation in politics, because it's still an issue. It was an issue in the beginning with the third, fifth, and seventh presidents. It was an issue with Mr. Trump and his advisor, Stephen Miller, and it's still an issue today, as this graph shows. So, very important slide there. Moving right along into my third main idea, which has to do with mass media and how it sabotages the Black image. The mass media sabotaging the Black image is it's very catastrophic to the Black family and the structure and the way that these the media, the owners of the media, the way that they portray African American people, whether it be on television or billboards or images in literature, the way that they portray them actually molds the minds not just of people of other cultures and nationalities, but also of Black people themselves. So when they look in the mirror, they see what they're fed or what they've been conditioned to see from the media, which will bring me to my next slide, which is Black men and mass media and the relationship that they have, and the picture that is painted of African American men through the media is one that is normally rather aggressive, or often Black men are shown as criminals or living in poverty, but never in more often than not, they are shown in a negative light as opposed to a positive one. And it's been discussed in the open on social media and even on broadcast television, that the African American community is speaking out as far as actors goes, who are really upset behind the representation that is behind the characters that they're playing. Here we have Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a really solid part of my research project. As a liberal arts student, I did have to read Uncle Tom's Cabin as a college student, and it was a different perspective than that of a high school student. And so it was important for me to include this because this was one of the first mainstream representations that was out of black children. The young girl Topsy, shown here on the left, was often described in just some using really bad descriptive words. She was called things like horrid, and I mean just everything short of being ugly or being a monster. And Topsy's character was, well, the book Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she was actually an abolitionist. So something that she meant for good, the media snatched it away and flipped it and turned it into this big, um, this big deal for entertainment purposes. And so Topsy, at one point in time, everywhere you look, there she was. And so, young black children had this, especially girls, had this as an example of their representation. And on the right, we have the two sisters by the name of the Duncan sisters that took the Topsy show on the road. As you can see, one sister is dressed in blackface, which is a whole nother research project in itself. But they made this a very popular show, and it lasted for many years, and they made a lot of money off of it. But the main thing is that it was very mainstream. And so black children, they at that time and before, at the time before television, it was all over the stage. And so this was the representation that they had. This next slide shows how black women are represented by mass media, and how they're stereotyped. And a lot of times the comparison between the black woman and a woman of a different race or nationality winds up, we're represented more hypersexual, and often at times as single moms or living in poverty, but there is a big lack of positive images of black women, being married or being well off, or not being hypersexualized. So the media has definitely caused a fury in the black community to where women are being conditioned at an early age by the things that they're seeing on television mainly, to be very sexual and to value things that are not normally shown on as Caucasian or their white counterparts. This next slide supports my third main idea, which is systemic racism. And this one is an example of environmental racism, which is a really big issue that is rather implicit. It's the most sad because you really can't do anything about it, and or you can do something about it, but it's hard to identify if you don't have the resources, and if you don't already identify it and you don't have the resources, or if you do identify it and you don't have the resources, it makes it hard for you to overcome systemic racism. And so this photograph here shows the different ways that Black communities are affected by environmental racism. The next form of systemic racism that I discuss in my paper is mass incarceration. This graph is pretty cool because it shows a visual of what's really happening. And the scariest thing here is that the ratios are just they're crazy. They're really I mean, by a landslide. Obviously Black men are being incarcerated 1 in 3 times, when white men is 1 in 17. And even Black women 1 in 18, while white women 1 in 111. I mean, these numbers are they're just outright unfair. And so mass incarceration was something important for me to touch bases on, because I feel like it is a modern day slavery, and I do discuss that in my research paper. This graph shows redlining, which is a way that a housing act was able to keep the African American community away from generational wealth. And also in cities where their white counterparts were able to place the things that caused environmental issues, such as pollution, and forced the African Americans to live in the neighborhoods that were polluted. These are the neighborhoods where they chose to put warehouses and freeways next to. And the redlining calls for African American families to not be able to gain any type of sustainable living or housing in these areas here that are shown in the red. So after being very long-winded in 14 slides, it brings me to the end of my presentation, where there is a video at the bottom here that you can play, where I discuss some life-changing habits, or I touch on some things that I discuss in my paper, which are going to be some life-changing habits that are going to help people in the Black community overcome systemic racism and the representation from the mass media, and just really understand white supremacy and the foundation of it, so that they can be better equipped to survive it. And so my objective in my paper is that even though some people feel like the African American community is not treated unjustly, I don't feel that way. I feel that they are treated unjustly. But what makes my research paper different from other research papers is how to combat that unfair treatment. And the way that I do that is through spirituality, mental health, and a good solid diet. So here's my reference page. I hope that you guys enjoyed this, and I hope that you have a good evening. Bye-bye.